What's going on, everybody? You are in the Hacker Valley studio with your hosts, Ron and Chris.
Yes, sir.
Welcome back to the show.
I'm glad to be back, and special thanks to SAS for you all the organizers, Kaspersky for putting this one together. Also, special thanks to our guest of honor, Will Lin, who is a partner and co-founder at ForgePoint Capital. Welcome, Will, and excited to chat with you today.
Likewise, guys. This is gonna be fun.
Awesome, Will. We are super close. We spend every week together, just about. It's almost been a year. This year has flown by in good ways and in bad. But for the folks that don't know who you are just yet, would love to hear a little bit about your background and what you're doing today.
Yeah, definitely. So I focus on venture capital, and so what I do is I specialize in investing in early stage startups. I'm a co-founder of a venture capital firm that does it, and the unique thing that we do is we only invest in cybersecurity companies. We believe that there is a lot of value in scale and a lot of value in focus, and so we've built a team as well as a portfolio to make us the most active investor in cybersecurity startups today.
Fantastic. I've spent almost my entire career up until maybe this last year in threat intelligence. I was a part of threat intelligence before it was even really a term, but I would love to hear the initial trends that you're seeing from the start of threat intelligence to today. Is there anything that stands out in your mind in the maturity and the build of threat intelligence?
I think the threat intel space has been so still very uncertain, Alex, to be very honest, on the startup side. In terms of why customers purchase from threat intel companies, what threat intel companies should exist out there in the world, what's needed, what's not. I don't think there's a lot of consensus yet. And we've invested in a couple of threat intelligence companies that provide feeds and generate feeds, as well as threat intel companies that provide a platform. I think the industry has flipped a couple different directions. Sometimes they really want a feed, sometimes they really want a platform. Sometimes no one really wants to acquire, no big company, public company wants to acquire a threat intel company one day. And then the next day they're super interested in it. And so what we're actually seeing now is actually a lot more interest in threat intelligence. So it's actually on the upward swing versus the downward swing it has in the past. Customers are more interested in very specific types of threat intelligence that solve very specific problems. And then acquirers are also very interested in acquiring threat intelligence companies nowadays, which has been a pretty unique scenario because that hasn't always been the case before. Most of the prior exits in security have been a lot smaller in threat intel. Basically, you're acquiring a team and a little bit of revenue, and that's about it. But nowadays, we're starting to see more acquisitions of platforms, companies that are worth a couple $100 million.
So when we look at threat intelligence, there's a lot of value that an organization can benefit from when it comes to detection or even response. But when I'm looking at it from a venture capital perspective, years ago I used to think, oh man, venture capitalists, they would invest in startups and their way of providing value is infusing these startups with capital. But for you, getting to know you and also ForgePoint, the goal and the mission, I understand that the way that you provide value kind of exceeds and goes beyond just infusing startups with capital. So what are some of the ways that you're hoping to provide value to the space?
Yeah. I mean, just to overlay that a little bit. I mean, I think one of the unique things about venture capital, and it's a perspective. Not every VC has to do it this way. But one of the ways of thinking about it is we actually are paid based on how much value we help create, right? Yes, there is the dollar amounts, the investment amounts, but there are so many VCs out there today. There's so much capital out there today that if you are a solid investable company, then what's the next step that you decide? Who do you decide to work with? And we do believe that it's the companies that actually help create value that are the ones that are going to be successful and have the opportunity to invest in some of the best companies as well. So what does that look like? I think of this very fondly, actually, just because there's so many ups and downs to helping a company build businesses, a lot of stress and a lot of happiness as well. And so, one big one that I always really love doing is helping their companies build their team. And it is, what type of person, like what type of roles and responsibilities, how senior they should be. Should it be where should they come from? Geographically, should it be a remote team? Should it be a local team? Should it be international? And how much should we pay these people? How what's the based on the pay gives you an idea of how much the seniority or the experience of the person is. And then the other one that's also really fun is, when you invest in a new company or join a new company as an employee, you of course want that company to be successful, right? Because of course there's cash and commission and bonus, but then another big reason why you're joining a company is because of the equity component, and you want that equity to be worth something someday. And it's really hard as an employee to know what company is going to be worth more and worth less. And so we are a trusted advisor on both sides, both the company who's hiring the employee as well as the employee who's joining, and helping them all sort of realize that this is the best win-win-win. Everyone's going to benefit from this, from working together. So I personally really love the hiring part. The other pieces that are really fun are, for instance, connecting customers to our companies as well. That requires a lot of skill, in my opinion, and a lot of nuance, because you have to make sure it's a win-win for both the customer and the vendor, right? On the vendor side, it's almost always a win to be connected to a CISO, almost always. Like they just want more visibility. But if that CISO doesn't have an active program, it's not working on trying to solve this problem that the vendor is solving, it's sort of actually a lose-lose on both sides.
Right.
And so, on our end, means a lot of time qualifying, making sure that it is a genuinely good intro and that everyone can benefit from it. And the reality is, it's not just like, hey, I'm a customer, I have a problem that needs to be solved, but there's so much more to it. There's a type of company I want to work with, geography, there's a style, there's a stage, there's a cost component that I'm interested in jumping in or out of. Sometimes they want to be advisors, sometimes they want to be boards. I mean, there's just so many of these things that we help to sort of help figure out on both sides.
In a lot of our conversations, the thing you hammer into my head, the comment that you nail into other people's heads is scale, scale, scale. I'd love to hear some of the other concepts and pillars that you are looking for when you're looking at companies. In addition to scale, what are some of the other things that people need to be thinking about when they're starting their startup and building these solutions for other companies?
Yeah, I think the thing and I was actually just having a conversation earlier today about it on one of my portfolio companies, and the person was asking me, hey, what's actually going on? Like, what's going on behind the scenes? Because I have visibility to this piece of the puzzle. Does this whole engine actually work, right? And so when you talk about scale, there's so many different components to it. Like, for instance, one example of scale is on the product, right? Does this actually work? Like, it's so common for a vendor to go into a big company and for that product to break because it just can't handle the scale of that large company. So there's architectural scale. There's cultural scale too, right? Like, as you're hiring team members, building a culture, building values, it goes from, one day it's 3 people, that's a lot easier to manage. It goes to 50 people, that's tough, but okay. It goes to hundreds, you're like, holy crap, how do I manage, all this scale in terms of people? And so there's a cultural component to it as well. That's one way of summarizing scale on the people side. And then there's scale in terms of how you bring awareness and sell your product as well. There are good ways, there are bad ways. Every sort of company, every product, every customer has a different way of how they want to work, how they want to purchase. And whether it's dollar amounts, whether it's direct versus inside sales, a scaling sales engine also is very difficult to create and takes a lot of time.
Right. One of the things that I love when we speak is just the insight that you have. It's almost like you have this magical crystal ball and you're making these early bets based off of the insight that you have from the practitioners, the CISOs, and even the individuals that are going through their first or second startup. What information do you need to make these types of strategic bets? And also, I would like for you to share, what domains are you focused on kind of immediately upcoming?
Yeah. So, what information do I need? I would say that I actually have a pretty big framework in terms of talking about how we evaluate companies. and it's aligned with the who, what, when, where, why, as well as how. And I've added how most recently to it as well. So, I don't want to spend 30 minutes just talking about the framework because I can definitely talk your ear off because I just love the framework so much. But what I will say is, maybe to summarize it a little bit is, as a VC, yes, we are a decision maker in terms of dollars, right? But once the dollars are in the company, we're a board member. And board members, we have ability to influence, but we can't just say, hey, you have to do this, hey, you have to do that. Like we're in an influencing role at the end of the day. And so if I were to summarize all of it down to one thing that's most critical, at least to me, it's the people. It's the people and how well can we all work together? What are their backgrounds? How coachable are they? And I think if they have that, there's a lot of things we can overcome. We can overcome a market that might be not very exciting yet or too small. We can overcome a product that's not yet ready. There's a lot of pieces that we can get there. But it's better if we don't have to overcome all those other issues, right? And so those other issues are, where's the product, where's the team, where's the market, how many customers do they have, and all these other really cool things. And that type of information, I'd have to say that it really comes through lots of filters and filters that we build up over time. And so it's hard for me to just say, hey, all I need to do is know the team, right? Like you have to, like what matters? Like what are the things I'm looking for when I'm meeting team potential entrepreneurs to work with? And a lot of those filters have come from my personal experience and other VCs' personal experience as well. So it's a little vague, but it's hard for me to quantify unless I spend a lot of time talking about it. In terms of places that I'm really interested in right now, I'm really spending a ton of time just thinking about the world's change, right? Like this is one of the fun times where I can, to your point, the crystal ball piece, where I can look into the future or try to look into the future and then try to make investments based off of it. And I think, of course, all of us are all thinking about COVID, thinking about working from home, thinking about remote, all that stuff, and how is that going to impact it? And so there are a couple of things that are sort of more like apparent and obvious, right? Like network, right? VPN, or how do you manage all these people when they're using their own computers at home? And so those are sort of like the initial pieces. But what I'm spending a lot of time is thinking about what's after that, what's after that, what's after that. And a couple of what's after that. One of them is I'm thinking a lot in terms of data. So, we talk about sort of how do we protect the endpoint or the devices that everyone's using, but why do they want to protect it, right? The reality is one of the reasons why they really want to protect it is they want to protect the data that's on there, as well as the data that it's accessing. And so, what does that look like in the future? Identity, obviously there's this whole zero trust thing, but what does that actually mean? How do you actually productize it? Because not everyone can be Google, who started the Beyond Corp idea. And so, development, how does development change and how does that look differently in the future world as well? So there's a lot of things that are all behind this one singular trend of, hey, our future of work is going to look very different. And how do we as security practitioners protect people?
You both mentioned crystal ball, and I don't think you need to look much further than threat intelligence when you're looking at the future, trying to make predictions, making assessments. I think that you can look at the threat environment space and you can see what is up and coming, what is the emerging threat, and you can build solutions around that. What do you think about taking that approach for folks that are out there looking to solve these types of problems?
I love this one because it is a very tangible point. I think that at the end of the day, right, when you think about the supply and demand, I like the spy versus spy type analogy, like where we're all trying to like one up each other. One way of being able to be very principled is to look at threat intelligence, look at the research. What I've learned over time, though, is that the research translating to real world and translating to startups and translating to markets actually takes quite a long time. And so, for instance, I'm still remembering like ransomware and cryptojacking, like the first hint of it, and it didn't really show up in the real world until like a year later, actually. And then a year later, EDR companies started benefiting a lot from it. And so The question is when looking at threat intel to predict the future and to predict, what threats are critical. I think the key one is thinking about which ones will actually happen sooner rather than later, and which ones will make the biggest amount of impact as well. And I think the thing I loved about those two examples, ransomware and cryptojacking, is that there's dollars involved in both of them, right? And so if there is a threat intelligence that's very well aligned to someone making money off of it, that's a higher probability of it becoming, more active in the wild than perhaps something else might be.
Right. So there's probably at least a few individuals on this call who are building out their threat intelligence program, and there's just so many vendors out there. Some are public, some are not public yet, some are still a startup. So from your perspective, when you're helping out CISOs pick a solution, what are some things that you typically prescribe for the organizations that are just in the very beginning steps of building out a threat intelligence capability or something like it?
Yeah. You remind me of a couple of examples or lessons learned or stories in the past in terms of helping a CISO work with threat intelligence for the first time. And I think there are some lessons learned, some which I actually learned from Chris in his talk, is that it actually doesn't require that many people to start the threat intel program at your company, right? Like, I think for whatever people assume that you need a team that's almost as big as your SOC team, to be able to manage all the threat intel that's out there, because there is a lot of threat intel out there.
Right.
And so I think the first thing is helping them realize that you can actually start one quite cost effectively. And that means giving them examples and showing them examples of effective threat intel programs. And then I think the next step after that, and that is a big one, I would say, because once they have these examples and they can see it, they can sort of start working on it, get comfortable with it. But then the next one is what threat intelligence makes the most sense for them, and what type and what. So for instance, a lot of retail companies, especially with e-commerce sites, they really love threat intelligence with regards to ad fraud, just things related to fraud, right? And so for them, they might not be looking for a platform to ingest all these different data feeds to figure out how to help their SOC, but they might be thinking about very specific intel feeds that specifically help them in terms of generating revenue or protecting their revenue. So I think that after that initial piece of showing them that it's not going to be impossible to start themselves, then it gets down to the sort of the nitty-gritty details between each of them. And sort of figuring out what's the exact driver, right? And I would say that the main key drivers that tend to show up as reasons to start up a threat intel program, or to do a lot of things in security. Compliance is a useful one. Alignment with revenue, protecting revenue, tends to be a really useful one. And then if they have a SOC, it tends to be a super useful one as well. Or some kind of response capability. It doesn't have to be a SOC, because now more and more people are automating their SOCs. But sort of that focus on response tends to be a useful piece as well. And then everything else beyond that tends to be sort of very use case, very specialized. So for instance, some companies really care about their executives, so they want threat intel there. Some people really care about social media. So then it gets really, really specific to that.
Fantastic. One thing that I think about when I think about threat intelligence analysts, I think about startups, I think about people just in cybersecurity in general, is fostering community. And there's not many people that have done a better job at fostering community than you, with security tinkerers and the group that we've built there. Really hats off to you and the folks that started it. But what do you have to advise for other people out there that are looking to not only make a bigger threat intelligence network, so they're talking with other people, other founders talking with other founders? What are the best ways for people to build their own community?
Yeah, I've participated in other people's communities as well, and what I've learned over time is that you can't just start one based off common interests. It's nice to have in those types of scenarios. When it really becomes a true community is when they're actually fundamental, real core friendships as part of that community. And those friendships are forged not over time. It can be digitally, it could be in person, but it definitely starts over time. And so in terms of the community that I'm involved in, I help build and I'm very proud of, is, I think a lot of reason why it was successful is because those initial people were all like really good friends or had really strong connections, and we were able to sort of build off of that. After that, then it comes down to a couple of different scenarios. So one scenario is culture and values. So we talked about, for instance, scale. In this case, this is one example of scale. How do we scale up the group in a way that's productive and helpful, and we still can preserve sort of our values and culture? And then the other piece is how do we, help people beyond just these, personal interests, right? So like if you have a Slack for video games, that's really nice. You have common interests in it. But what takes it to the next level is when you actually get to know each person, and you actually help them not just professionally or in their hobby, but also personally as well. And so my advice to everyone who is related to community building community is that you have to help the whole person. You can't just help them in one specific piece.
Right. And I'm sure for you, you've mentored so many, you're even a mentor to Chris and I, and you've built this community that has all these great individuals in it. And shout outs to everyone that's presented today. I've learned a lot, and there's some very compelling research. So I would imagine that there's going to be one entrepreneur on this call, maybe someone that watches this later on that has a great idea with threat intelligence or something related in cybersecurity. Is there any sequence of steps that you'd recommend for a first-time entrepreneur to kind of build their brand or build their startup and ultimately get in front of VCs?
Yeah, when I look at a lot of my CEOs and startups and portfolio companies, a lot of them are actually first-time entrepreneurs or pretty early as a result. And the reason why I like working with first-time entrepreneurs is because this whole building aspect. I mean, it's tough being a first-time entrepreneur. Like you literally have zero idea which direction to go, what's good, what's bad. Like, how are you doing? We don't know. Like, it's hard to say. And so as a result, by being able to work with first-time entrepreneurs, I can take a lot of knowledge and experience and help them sort of shape a pattern, help them figure out how, what we're doing, and help them create goalposts together. So in that vein, before someone comes to me or to another VC, I have a lot of advice for sure. And I think the number one advice that I would share with someone like that is to spend a lot of time thinking about product market fit. It's a word that you've seen before, and so I like to define that a little bit more in this specific instance. And in this specific instance, I'm referring to spending a lot of time with customers, spending a lot of time understanding the problem, not what they just say up front to you, like, oh, data security is a problem, right? Like that's one thing, but there's so much more to it than that. And so spending the time to really, truly understand the problem. And then by truly understanding the problem, you can actually build a product that is leveraging the power of technology to solve that problem, right? Like, and that's at the end of the day, the whole point of startups, right? Like if I'm a practitioner and I have a problem to solve, if I can build it myself, awesome. I'd love to do that. If I had the resources, if I had the time, great, awesome. But the reality is very few people do have the resources, the time to do all this effort themselves. So they know it's valuable, but they're thinking, okay, how do I scale up my security program? Well, I scale it up because I'm paying this vendor to do it for me. And so in that way, it's a win-win scenario. And so building a product that actually is solving a problem and easily justifying the cost of that solution is not easy to achieve. And I think the more someone focuses on that and the less they focus on everything else, the more that when they do come to start doing fundraising, the more obvious it will be that this is a company that you want to work with. Because if you come out of VC with just an idea, like, oh, there's this idea, I've seen this problem so many times, really great, I'm going to change the world with this idea, let's go. It's like, okay, cool, but like, it's an idea. Ideas are dime a dozen. I've heard this idea many times. And so, tell me what are you going to do about it in terms of solving the problem versus just throwing an idea at the VC.
Will, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with us. Thanks, SAS, for inviting us to come do this live interview. For the folks that want to stay up to date with you or want to stay up to date with VC and cybersecurity, what are the best ways that people can do that?
Best one for sure is LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I love it. And so I post a lot of stuff on there, and we also have our own hashtag in the Tinkers called Tinker Tribe. So that's another great way to sort of watch all the content that the Tinkers are putting together.